we do have free media, and nevertheless, there is a way to twist facts and move opinion.
To truly understand the concept of infiltration over invasion and the slow divide it has brought this country over, namely the last 16 years, one must first understand the Ukraine. For hundreds of years, Ukraine and Russia have been connected in one way or form. Like most Eurasian countries, it has had an ever-changing border. But for this video, we're going to be starting back nearly 400 years ago, in the year 1648. It's at this time that Ukraine experiences a Cossack uprising against Polish rule, resulting in everything east of the Dnieper River becoming part of Russia in 1654. And by the mid to late 1700s, nearly all of Ukraine had been assimilated into Russia. For almost a century and a half and throughout the entirety of the 1800s, the two would remain one country. Then, with Europe to the west entrenched in the chaos of World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution would begin in October 1917, fermenting the collapse of the Russian Empire. That December, the Ukrainian People's Republic of Soviets was declared. And 5 years later, in December of 1922, Ukraine would team up with their former countryman Russia to found the USSR. The final piece to the Ukrainian puzzle would come to fruition in 1954, where Khrushchev, in order to mark the 300th anniversary of Ukraine's merger with the Russian Empire, had gifted Crimea, a region which had been part of Russia for centuries, to the Ukraine. Some people speculate as to the real reason as being a payback in response to Stalin's man-made famine 2 decades earlier, a famine which had resulted in the death of millions of Ukrainians. Nevertheless, Crimea would remain a part of the Ukraine for the next 60 years.
President Boris Yeltsin today recognized the independence of 2 Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, and the second largest Soviet republic, the Ukraine, today declared its independence. All of these developments bring long-awaited joy to Ukrainian emigres in our area. Channel 2's Lisa Councilman continues our team coverage.
An already emotional week ended today as the people of the Ukraine embarked on a new beginning, becoming the 5th republic to break away from the Kremlin.
November 21st, 2004. Viktor Yanukovych is elected president of Ukraine in a runoff election. The election results, however, are immediately contested by rival opponent Viktor Yushchenko and his supporters, with many international observers claiming the election to be rigged. These claims are made on the back of exit polls, which had earlier shown the more European-friendly Yushchenko winning by 11% over the more Russian-friendly Viktor Yanukovych. Cries of the Russians allegedly rigging the 2004 election begin, and massive protests form in the streets of Kiev. Dick Morris, a former advisor to Bill Clinton, later admitted to a meeting with members of Yushchenko's team where he had advised them that a big exit poll might be helpful to bring protesters out into the streets, if, of course, they were big enough to indicate the election was rigged. Well, luckily for them, they were big enough, and cries of a rigged election had come with exactly that, massive protests in the streets, which came to be known as the Orange Revolution. The protests were successful, and a new election was held, hailing this time Yushchenko, the new president of Ukraine. The only problem is that the exit polls were mostly funded by George Soros. You see, back in April of 1990, a year before the fall of USSR, George Soros had founded in Ukraine the International Renaissance Foundation. The IRF is an integral part of the Open Society Foundation and is one of the largest charity organizations, if not the largest, in all of Ukraine. Since 1990, Soros's IRF has supported numerous Ukrainian non-governmental organizations, community groups, academic and cultural institutions, publishing houses, and more. So for 14 years at this point in 2004, the IRF had donated upwards of $100 million to education, literature, and community organizing. And it's over the course of this time that a divide had grown in Ukraine between the rising pro-European West and the more Russian-friendly East. And by 2004, it had hit ahead. Now, after the Orange Revolution was over, the EU-friendly Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko had become president and prime minister, respectively. You see, in Ukraine, both positions exist, with the president representing the entire country and the prime minister being the head of government. So following the Orange Revolution, Yushchenko becomes president of Ukraine and Tymoshenko becomes prime minister of Ukraine. So this stays like this for a little over a year. And then 2006, Yanukovych, who had actually been prime minister before he had run for president in 2004, defeats Tymoshenko and becomes prime minister once again. So this is a pattern you're going to see here, as by this point there was a definite struggle for power between the two factions, as is clearly evident from this election map just how divided the country was. Now, furthermore, if you look at this language map, it makes sense, as you can see that the East had many more citizens who still spoke Russian, with Crimea even having a majority of its population speaking Russian. Now, it's of note that while Yanukovych was running for this 2006 prime ministership bid, Yushchenko's Minister of Internal Affairs, Yuri Lutsenko, had opened an investigation on Yanukovych and claimed that because of this, it precluded him from running, in what seemed an obvious attempt to sabotage his chances. Now, this was eventually proven false, and Yanukovych is elected prime minister in 2006. Now, after a volatile year of Tymoshenko and Yanukovych and Yushchenko, with all three of them going in and out of feuding and thin alliances, finally, the two who were affiliated with the Orange Revolution, Tymoshenko and Yushchenko, sign a coalition, and at the end of 2007, she becomes prime minister once again. And that's how it would stay until 2010, with Tymoshenko as prime minister and Yushchenko as president. Now, I know it's a pretty volatile timeline, but it's a good lesson in caution as to what can happen when a Soros type digs his claws into all aspects of your society. Now, that's not to say it's foolproof, because in 2010, the political war heats up once more, with Yanukovych again winning the presidency. But this time, the election is deemed fair, and he finally gets to take up the mantle he was denied all the way back in 2004 when this started with the sparking of the Orange Revolution. Now, this is where things get interesting. In 2011, Tymoshenko is thrown in jail for abuse of power in relation to her handling of a gas crisis 2 years earlier. And in 2012, Lutsenko, who had investigated Yanukovych while he was running for prime minister in 2006, was also thrown in jail for embezzlement and abuse of office. Now, many, obviously on Tymoshenko and Yushchenko's side, viewed these imprisonments as political prosecution. It's also around this time in 2012 that Ukrainian prosecutor general Viktor Sanka begins investigating the natural gas company Burisma Holdings over allegations of money laundering, tax evasion, and corruption. But this investigation would be cut short, and Yanukovych would see his presidency once again ousted by political protest. You see, also in 2012, the European Union had begun talks to try and bring Ukraine into the EU. However, on November 21st, 2013, Yanukovych announces that he is not going to sign an association agreement with the European Union, and instead takes what he perceives to be a better trade offer by Russia. The streets of Kiev explode, just like the Orange Revolution of 2004. A tsunami of demonstrations and civil unrest in Ukraine, known as Euromaidan, begin with huge public protests at Independence Square in Kiev. Maidan actually means town square in Ukrainian. That's where it got the name Euromaidan from. Now, the only difference is that this time, the protests were more organized and even had a news organization dedicated to the conflict named Euromaidan Press, which kept the people of the movement and the public in general informed on the protests, while also making English broadcasts so the Western world could too see what was going on. The Euromaidan Press was supported by none other than George Soros' International Renaissance Foundation. So George Soros is once again in charge of the core chunk of information surrounding a political riot. Much like many have accused him of being behind the numerous well-organized political protests following the 2016 United States elections. Only in Ukraine, not only is it in writing, but in this CNN interview from May 27, 2014, he actually confesses to being behind the political upheaval. Watch.
George Soros, pleasure to have you on.
Same here.
First, on Ukraine, one of the things that many people recognized about you was that you, during the revolutions of 1989, funded a lot of dissident activity, civil society groups in Eastern Europe, in Poland, the Czech Republic. Are you doing similar things in Ukraine?
Well, I set up a foundation in Ukraine before Ukraine became independent of Russia. And the foundation has been functioning ever since. And it played an important part in events now.
It has played an important part in events now. He admits it. Yet suggesting that he's attempting to do the exact same thing here is considered a conspiracy. Why? His Open Society Foundation has sunk themselves into all the exact same factions of society. And likewise, we have seen a growing divide amongst our population. So it's a fair assertion, if anything. But back to his comments on the IRF playing an important role in the events of Ukraine in 2014. Yes, obviously, if it is the one supporting the Euromaidan Press, then it's playing arguably the most important role in these events. If you can control the narrative, you can control the people. Now, one spot, however, where the Euromaidan protest differed from its predecessor in the Orange Revolution is that these riots actually proved to be much more violent this time around. In total, more than 100 people were killed and 2,500 injured, with it hitting a head in late February. And on February 22nd, 2014, President Yanukovych and Ukrainian Prosecutor General Sanka are forced to flee to Ukraine over to Moscow. Yulia Tymoshenko is released from prison and the 2004 constitution is reinstated. Then, in response to the increase in violence towards pro-Russian Ukrainians in March of 2014, Russia sends in troops to protect the majority pro-Russian Crimea and annexes it back to Russia. It is right after this overthrow of government on May 13, 2014, that Hunter Biden and Devon Archer, the college roommate of John Kerry's stepson, are named to the board of directors of Ukraine's largest gas company, Burisma Holdings, whose troubles had just been exiled to Moscow with prosecutor Sanka. June 27, 2014, Ukraine's new, more European-friendly president, Poroshenko, signs an association agreement with the EU, and by the end of 2015, he awards George Soros with Ukraine's Order of Liberty, one of its highest honors, in Kiev. Poroshenko states that Soros' International Renaissance Foundation has, quote, played a big role in the development of Ukraine's statehood in the past 25 years, as he honors him that night. So, here's an example of what happens when Soros succeeds with his manipulations in a country. He set up a foundation in 1990, right as they were about to become independent for the first time in 70 years, and under the moniker of charity, he was able to insert his manipulations into every part of society, exactly as he has done here. The educational system, the printing presses, the news, and community organizing. Through protests and propaganda, he was able to put in place a more cabal-friendly leadership and send them on the path to joining the European Union. And of course, this movement was more popular with younger voters because through the machinations of this so-called charity, they had been able to plant seeds through mediums over the course of 2 decades. The older voters were, of course, more inclined to lean towards their centuries of ties with Russia, so trying to turn them would be hopeless. But younger voters are blank slates and had grown up with the rising popularity and push of this movement. Here is where we find ourselves when Viktor Shokin inherits the Burisma Holdings case in early 2015, which was started by the now exiled Sanka. This time, however, the 2 owners of John Kerry's stepson's private equity firm, Rosemont Seneca Partners, Devon Archer and Hunter Biden, have since joined the board of Burisma Holdings. What you're about to hear is the Secretary of State, John Kerry, first pressuring Poroshenko to fire Shokin in December of 2015. Listen.
But before Vice President Biden comes, I just wanted to try to urge you to see if there's a way to get by this problem of replacing the Prosecutor General, Shokin, because from our perception, he's blocked the cleanup of the Prosecutor General's office, and I know the Vice President is very concerned about it, and I think it'd be good to try to have some resolution of that before the Vice President comes, if it's possible.
Now, all of us should understand that the Prosecutor General office has no any opportunity under the law to make any cases against corruption, because it immediately goes already from the 1st of December, the day before yesterday, to the new Anti-Corruption Bureau and the new Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office. And I was very proud that Jean-Claude Juncker, Angela Merkel, François Hollande, and everybody welcomed it as a very strong position of Anti-Corruption Prosecutor and General Prosecutor Office. For the prosecutor position and for Inspector General, I am also proud that exactly as we agreed with your Minister of Justice guy and your embassy, the Office of Inspector General is already established. It is coordinated not by General Prosecutor but the Deputy of General Prosecutor, Mr. Sakvarilidze, exactly as we agreed with the Vice President and with the Ambassador. For the other continuation with the Prosecutor General Shokin and other things, I think I will speak with the Vice President Biden, and I doubt that it would be theoretically even possible to make any decision without any arguments before.
Vice President's going to take up with you, and we'll have a more detailed discussion about it.
Thank you, John.
Okay, so Kerry tries to make up some BS that Shokin isn't cleaning up the prosecutor role and should be removed, and Poroshenko essentially shoots him down and says that that's a different field anyway now, but says that he's going to wait for Biden. But here's where you start to see how the situation works and why they work to collapse these governments and put in more friendly people. Because now that Ukraine is essentially cut ties with Russia following the Euromaidan coup, they no longer have access to the loans they used to rely on from Russia. So now Ukraine is dependent on loans from the U.S., which affords the Obama administration the exact sort of power you're going to see Biden exhibit right here, where he refuses Poroshenko a $1 billion loan guarantee unless Prosecutor Shokin is fired. Biden recounts the circumstances of said quid pro quo here.
That is, I'm desperately concerned about the backsliding on the part of Kyiv in terms of corruption. They made, I'll give you one concrete example. I was, not but it just happened to be, that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, or others, to convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
So there you have it. Right from his mouth, the world got to hear how Vice President Biden used his power of influence for personal gain in the way of removing a powerful threat to his son's company, Burisma Holdings. And now, even more damning evidence is surfaced. In this newly released audio, you will hear Vice President Biden and President Poroshenko actually working out the illegal exchange.
Yesterday, I meet with the General Prosecutor Shokin.
Yes.
And despite of the fact that we didn't have any corruption charges, we don't have any information about he doing something wrong, I especially asked him, no, it was the day before yesterday, I especially asked him to resign. As his position as a state person, and despite of the fact that he has a support in the parliament. And as a finish of my meeting with him, he promised me to give me the statement on resignation. And 1 hour ago, he bring me the written statement of his resignation.
Great.
And this is my second step for keeping my promises.
I agree. Assuming that there is a new government and a new prosecutor general, I am prepared to do a public signing of the commitment for the $1 billion. Again, I'm not suggesting that that's what you want or don't want. I'm just suggesting that that's what we're prepared to do. And again, it wouldn't be finalized until, the IMF pieces are written.
Extremely strong motivation. One of the possible candidates was leader of my fraction, Lutsenko, who is the public figure. If you think that the political motivated figure would be not very good from your point of view, I recall this proposal. I do not propose, because nobody knows that I want to propose Lutsenko. In this situation, I take all the political motivated figures out from this process.
All right, well, look, let me when you and I finish speaking, let me huddle with my team, talk over what you and I just talked about. I agree with you, there is a sense of urgency here.
Look, what we're doing now, I think that within last 3 weeks, we demonstrate the real great progress in the reform. We voted in the parliament 100% tariffs, despite of the fact that the IMF expected only 75%. We launching the real reform of the state-owned enterprises. We launching reform for the prices for the medicine, removing all the obstacles.
No, you did a lot. I agree. Hey, Mr. President, Joe Biden, how are you?
Very well indeed. As usual when I hear your voice. Thank you very
Well,
much.
you are doing very well. Congratulations on getting the new prosecutor general. I know there's a lot more that has to be done, but I really think that's good, and I understand you're working with the rod in the coming days on a number of additional laws to secure the IMF. So, but congratulations on installing the new prosecutor general. It's going to be critical for him to work quickly to repair the damage Shokin did. And I'm a man of my word. And that now that the new prosecutor general is in place, we're ready to move forward in signing that new $1 billion loan guarantee. And I don't know how you want to go about that.
So there you have it. A real quid pro quo laid out in their own words, going back and forth over the course of a couple months. I mean, Joe Biden lays it out step by step over the course of these phone calls. He wanted Shokin gone. He held $1 billion over Poroshenko's head to make sure that happened. And after a couple months, it did. And who did he replace him with? Lutsenko, the prosecutor who had went after Yanukovych back in 2006 and was then subsequently jailed by him in 2012, is reinstated, and just like Biden had promised, he signs the $1 billion loan guarantee to Ukraine. 1 year later, in 2017, investigations into Burisma Holdings are completed with no charges filed. And that is how the cabal, through Soros, first destabilized Ukraine into a near civil war and then took it over. which opened the floodgates for cabal alumni such as Biden, Kerry, and others to exploit it. And how do you loot a country on a macro scale? Obviously, on a micro scale or local scale, it's looting exactly how we picture it. For example, here's some pictures of former prosecutor Sanka's mansion, which was looted right after he was forced to flee with Yanukovych. But on a macro or global scale, you don't loot stores or homes, you loot a country's natural resources. That's why they all have their family and friends hooked up with energy companies. Even the Uranium One case traces back to Clinton and Kazakhstan. But that's what seems to be happening in these countries, with Biden taking this case even a step further by grossly misusing his power as vice president for personal gain to protect one of these corrupt dealings. Now, here's Shokin breaking down how Poroshenko did it.
He came to me and said, "You are a patriot of Ukraine. We need this $1 billion. We're at war, and if you are a patriot, you will close this case." My conversation with Poroshenko on this, Shokin says, was in a phone call. It was after we started seizing Burisma assets in Ukraine when Poroshenko called me and said, "Listen, this all has to stop already. Joe Biden's temper is overflowing. This seizing of Burisma assets," said Poroshenko, was the last straw. Shokin says Poroshenko then paid him a visit in his office, asking for Shokin's resignation. Shokin responded and asked, "Why do I have to go? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm doing my job. This is standard procedure. We have reason to freeze Burisma assets." And Poroshenko said, "Biden is angry about you freezing Burisma assets. I'll figure something out."
All right, so there you have it. In Shokin's own words, in Poroshenko's own words, and in Biden's own words twice. Now ask yourself a question. Why isn't the news lighting Biden up over this? I mean, this is a huge story that involves a former senator confessing on tape to a major crime he committed while in the White House. And their answer is to help him get back into the White House? That doesn't seem strange to anybody. I mean, maybe that's the manipulation. Maybe the people you think you hate aren't so bad after all. Maybe your hatred is merely a result of decades of Soros-funded media. If you can control the narrative, you can control the people. And this is what he does. His Open Society Foundation funds many media outlets across all United States platforms and has for many years. And just look at the power of persuasion. 2016, right? Media created an absolute frenzy over the comments Trump had made in private about being able to grab a woman. Not that he had, just him bragging that he could and she wouldn't care. Media goes wild with anger. Public, wild with anger. Yet now you have Biden, who actually did grab a woman against her will, and this one with actual proof in the way of a phone call from the mother to Larry King years prior, lining up with her story and proving her claims. And not only is the media not losing their mind on him, but rather they're actively burying it, and social media platforms are implementing algorithms to hide posts about it. Look at the result. The same people who crucified the president for his remarks are not only admitting that they believe her, but are stating that they're going to vote for Biden anyway. One guy joked about doing it and you lost your minds. The other guy actually did it and you're voting for him. If you can control the narrative, you can control the people. December of 2019, media supported impeaching a president over alleged quid pro quo because he had asked the president of Ukraine to look into the real quid pro quo stated out loud by Biden himself at a CFR meeting just a year earlier. Okay? One guy asked about a quid pro quo and the media crucified him. The other guy actually did a quid pro quo and the media has you wanting to vote for him. The power of persuasion. You claim to hate racism, yet here's Joe Biden, someone who was caught lying about marching in civil rights protests, told a black audience that if they voted for Mitt Romney, they were going to, quote, be put back in chains, and who just this week told this interviewer that if black voters had a problem figuring out whether or not they're voting for him, then they ain't black. And you're voting for him, all right? Not only are you voting for him, but according to the feminist author Kathleen Polite, she would still vote for Joe Biden if he boiled babies and ate them, because we need morals back in the White House, all right? I mean, you try and figure that one out. All I'll say is this. Before you let these people decide your vote yet again, maybe it's time to take a closer look at who's currently in the White House and reevaluate just how much of that hate is actually yours and how much of it is really a result of a compromised media. The director of the CIA, William Casey, was once quoted back in 1981 as stating that they'll know their disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false. Now, do you really feel a certain way about President Trump? Or are those feelings a result of a disinformation program set forth and mostly funded by George Soros? Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to the Carter administration, famously stated in 1972, "Shortly the public will be unable to reason or think for themselves. They'll only be able to parrot the information they've been given on the previous night's news." Well, coincidentally, one of the president's loudest voices in creating the Trump narrative is his daughter, Mika Brzezinski. Now, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who later in life was a foreign affairs consultant to President Obama, had also written in his 1998 book, The Grand Chessboard, that the U.S. had to take control of Ukraine, arguing that the country is, quote, a new and important space on the Eurasian chessboard and a geopolitical pivot because its very existence as an independent country means Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. Now, that was in 1998. Well, luckily for him, due to Soros-funded exit polls and Soros-funded media hubs and Soros-trained protesters, this was indeed seen to fruition only 6 years later in 2004.
Hundreds of thousands of pro-democracy Ukrainians in the streets today protested against the results of the presidential election.
Demonstrators clash with police, with hundreds of thousands protesting the results of the election and calling for a new vote.
The parliament voted to disband the government of the candidate who has been declared the winner of the disputed presidential election.
Pro-Moscow Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych. They claim Yanukovych's victory was rigged.
A mere 6 years after Zbigniew Brzezinski declares Ukraine a, quote, pivotal piece on the grand chessboard, it is taken down by a George Soros-funded revolution. And this, by far, is not the first time George Soros had funded student uprisings to overthrow a government. In the year 2000, the overthrow of Slobodan Milošević in Serbia was mostly incited by the student-driven NGO Otpor. Let's see what the LA Times had to say about Otpor back in 2001. Belgrade, Yugoslavia. Serbia and Montenegro was still considered Yugoslavia at this point. But Belgrade, Yugoslavia. It's an accomplishment that Hungarian-born financier George Soros doesn't flaunt. Bragging about it, after all, could just make his global democracy-building mission more difficult. But the multi-billionaire philanthropist quietly played a key role in the dramatic overthrow last year of President Slobodan Milošević. His Soros Foundation's network helped finance several pro-democracy groups, including the student organization Otpor, which spearheaded grassroots resistance to the authoritarian Yugoslav leader. All right, so here's another quote, grassroots NGO Otpor holding massive protests to oust a world leader financed by George Soros. Documented. And of course, when you look up the bulldozer revolution, as it has come to be known as, there is nothing but press stating that these protests and overthrows were a good thing, much like when you look up Euromaidan. And I'm not saying like either was or wasn't. You know, I wasn't there. I didn't grow up in these countries, so I feel like I can never truly understand the situation. You know what I mean? But I would like to try, and it's hard when I look up something and I'm only presented with one side of a story over and over and over. It makes me immediately suspicious, especially since both of these governments were toppled by Soros-funded and provoked mass protests. Now, in regards to the Zapor overthrow in Serbia, I was eventually able to find this article by The Guardian, which does do a good job dispelling most of the slander against Milosevic, but it was too little too late because he had already died in jail. But moving up to 2003, you have yet another example in the Rose Revolution in Georgia, where following an election, the Kamara Youth Organization, another Soros-funded NGO, spearheaded massive protests, eventually leading to the ousting of President Shevardnadze. He actually had seen the writing on the wall a few months earlier and called Kamara and Soros out that summer for holding anti-governmental protests, stating that an international organization shouldn't be providing support for anti-governmental forces, which obviously, that's a legit attack. That's an infiltration attack, which is 100 times worse than a head-on military conflict. It's poison in the well, subverting the minds of a country's citizens to turn them against itself, essentially. Infiltration over invasion. And as it turned out, Shevardnadze, unfortunately for him, was proven right. Through the Soros-funded Kamara, they were able to infiltrate the country of Georgia's society and rip it apart from the inside out. They then began protests and waited for the right moment to explode, resulting in the overthrow of President Shevardnadze, which appears to be the MO in the majority of these overthrows.
Ახლა განაცხადე ის რაც ახლა განაცხადე
All right, so that was the Rose Revolution in 2003 in Georgia, spearheaded by another Soros-funded NGO, the Kamara. And of course, right after that, a year later, as we already went over in this video, in 2004, you had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, where the protesters were trained by Soros's International Renaissance Foundation. And it's the same story in all these countries and many more. Soros, through the use of NGOs, takes over media outlets and academic institutions, then slowly begins turning local youth against their government while also driving divides in the public itself, eventually reaching a breaking point, at which time these NGOs then conduct massive protests to topple the government. And after that, a new Soros/Cabal-friendly leadership is installed, and all the deep state rats just loot it like an old-fashioned pillaging. And really, all they need is control of the airwaves and paid protesters, which they have both here, and seemingly in most countries across the Western world. Once you have that, creating chaos is the easy part. Step one is the easiest part of all. Just simply have the media handpick a story. There's 328 million people in this country, all right? So there is a story for any single scenario you could imagine once a week. So pick one, any story. Pick the story that will create the outcome you want. Step two, whip the public up into a frenzy over it. Step three, import protesters. And step four, have the media act shocked at the rioting while infusing their reports with propaganda against whomever the initial target was before you even looked up what story you were going to use in the first place. The media is like a video game controller that people like Soros and the Cabal use to make you feel and do whatever they want you to. They will have you loot, burn, and kill if they need you to. Oh, did your presidential candidate say something that's crazy racist and could definitely sink him? Well, just go to the people killed by cops list. Pick one that was black, whip the public up into a frenzy, import Soros-funded protesters, and then report only that for 24 hours a day while they invoke mob mentality, getting the actual citizens of that area to help burn down their own neighborhood. What about Biden now? No one's mentioned him. Just got outed for getting the prosecutor who was going after his son and John Kerry's son's friend company fired. That's major news. Washed from the news cycle the second it came out. 100% Minneapolis coverage now. Or what about Biden saying that black people not voting for him aren't black? It was starting to ramp up, and now washed out of the news cycle. 100% Minneapolis covers, along with the racist white cop narrative. You see, what they won't show you is that almost as many Hispanics are killed by cops every year as well. How come they don't pick one of those stories to go with? Whites are killed by cops more, nearly twice as much as black people. Are these self-hating white cops? Or take it a step further, you're telling me that out of all these hundreds of shootings, not one of these cops was black? Yeah, okay. Now, twice as many white people are killed each year, but they don't report on a single one. And in fact, this is actually in direct correlation with the population of people living in poverty. Now, you wouldn't know that because the 16 million white people living in poverty are discarded and thrown away like garbage, but there are nearly twice as many white people living in poverty as black. The same ratio as whites killed by police as blacks. So actually, statistically speaking, this is a poor situation, not a racial one. Yet the news doesn't report it as such, because if they did, they couldn't continue to get this to happen. I mean, really, just look at 2019. 235 black people were shot and killed by cops. They could do this, what you're watching in Minneapolis, 5 times a week if they wanted to. All they got to do is report it a certain way, right? It's a formula that they use to topple countries. Now, I'm not saying these deaths are right or that they don't break my heart. I'm just simply pointing out that they are being exploited right now to create terror. This is a terror attack on the United States, brought to you by cabal-run NGOs and a coordination of their propaganda stations. Minneapolis police already confirmed that many of the protesters they have been arresting are not even from Minneapolis. So, that just fits the bill 100%. These are started by outside protesters. Same MO over and over. And here's a video of the AutoZone that was burnt down and someone smashing it with a hammer beforehand. When the camera gets closer, you can see he's white, first of all, and then someone calls him out as being a cop and he immediately gets weird and runs away.
Are you a fucking cop?
See, once he was questioned, he starts running away. And this guy asks him what his badge number is. Here's another one right in Dallas where they're protesting because, of course, spontaneous protests just popped up in all these cities now. Yeah, right. But look at what they found here.
This the setup.
They put them there on purpose,
y'all know where we at.
They gonna set them hoes right up on the route.
Y'all know what building this is right here. I ain't even gonna say what name it is.
Hey, where do them bricks go to? Where do them bricks go to? Where do them bricks go to?
We gotta do better.
Ain't no damn construction.
Gotta do better.
Ain't no damn construction around here.
I see.
Ain't no damn construction around here. You just gonna set a pallet of bricks right there. Oh, okay.
Listen, I did jury duty 3 months ago. Y'all don't keep no bricks right there. Do better.
All right, so a pallet of bricks just left there for the protesters. Still think this is spontaneous, popping up in every city? And look at these people caught a reporter standing next to the camera playing gunshot effects on his phone. Yeah, and then once they start filming him, I didn't know what I was watching. Yeah, right. Here, look at this.
This is what I saw. And why would you play that shit?
He's the one who played.
You knew what it was. You did that on purpose. You just destroyed it. You destroyed a peaceful protest. Why did you do that? An innocent man died. He had a family. He had parents.
And
this is what they do. They're professionals by now. They whip the public up into a frenzy using social media and other avenues, and then send in paid agitators as a way to spark violence, spark riots. How do you whip them up into a frenzy? I mean, look here, right at the Open Society Foundation's 2014 tax filings, all right? You have $300,000 to support Color of Change, $400,000 to support Color of Change, all right? These are stemming back to 2012, right around the time we shifted from the Occupy Wall Street riots to all the black neighborhood riots, okay? Color of Change is partners with Black Lives Matter, okay? Funded by George Soros' Open Society Foundation to promote civic engagement. So basically what I'm saying is that if you're looking back at, say, the Optor Bulldozer Revolution in Yugoslavia, or the International Renaissance Foundation's Orange Revolution in Ukraine, or the Kamara's Rose Revolution in Georgia, or the International Renaissance Foundation's Euromaidan, and wondering to yourself how the public weren't able to see what was happening right in front of their faces, or how these were setups by George Soros NGOs and George Soros media. I mean, if you're wondering how these citizens could let this build for so many years without realizing, you're seeing it right now in real time here. I mean, we've been seeing this same wash, rinse, repeat pattern here for 16 years. And by the time of the 2004 Orange Revolution, he had already been working on Ukraine for about 14 years with his IRF. But what was he doing right here in the United States, right as that was getting ready to come to fruition? The Washington Post sums it up perfectly in this November 2003 article. Soros, who has financed efforts to promote open societies in more than 50 countries around the world, is bringing the fight home, he said. On Monday, he and a partner committed up to $5 million to MoveOn.org, a liberal activist group, bringing to $15.5 million the total of his personal contributions to oust Bush. So right there, of his own admission, after decades of collapsing governments in Europe, he is, quote, bringing the fight back home and begins funding NGOs and various groups right here in America. Now, if you go further down here, it states that he's going to give ACT, America Coming Together, $10 million, right? Now, this is a media company that creates content. This is how you commandeer the minds of a society. If you can control the narrative, you can control the people. For instance, in 2004, ACT created the Wake Up Everybody album as an attempt to sway the vote to get John Kerry into office, featuring Missy Elliott, Ashanti, Mariah Carey, Mary J. Blige, Brandy, Wyclef Jean, Monica, Puff Daddy, Eve, Lil' Kim, Queen Latifah, Destiny's Child, Usher, Snoop Dogg, Music, Justin Timberlake, Jamie Foxx, Reverend Run, Jada Kiss, everyone you could imagine is on this friggin' album. Lenny Kravitz, Pharrell Williams, Robin Thicke, Jennifer Lopez, Jay-Z, Eric Clapton, the list goes on. The most influential entertainers of 2004 delivering a political message to the public. Brought to you and your mind by George Soros. Okay, and they just layer funding through 100 different avenues and parent companies, and before you know it, the cabal has 90% control over what all the youth of the nation ingest on a daily basis. For instance, Media Matters was, quote, created with $2 million in donations from wealthy liberals and was developed with help from the newly formed Center for American Progress. Who's their president and chief executive officer? John Podesta. And according to the Washington Post, the Center for American Progress were funded $3 million by none other than George Soros. Media Matters also gets their funding from MoveOn.org, which we already saw is funded by Soros. They also receive funding from the Tides Foundation and Democracy Alliance, two more which are funded by Soros. And that's just a small example of how they weave their influence in and out of all these different companies. On September 12, 2003, George Soros told PBS's David Brancaccio, quote, I give away something up to $500 million a year throughout the world promoting open society. My foundations support people in the country who care about an open society. It's their work that I'm supporting, so it's not me doing it, but I can empower them, I can support them, and I can help them. Well, ain't that the truth? Now, Brancaccio then adds, indeed, over the past 20 years, Soros has given away more than $4 billion of his fortune. He's built a philanthropic network that spans more than 50 countries, promoting what he calls open societies, with the goal of establishing democratically elected governments that respect human rights. How could you have the nerve to call what you're doing philanthropic and saying it's about human rights when you're funding violent protests and creating havoc? This guy's an economic terrorist. That's what he was doing before he was collapsing governments with protests and subversion and everything. He was collapsing their monetary systems by buying and selling currency. Soros ends here at the end, if you listen carefully, quite the lucid thought where he says, and as long as there is enough support for it, then you can actually make a difference in the world, and I think we are succeeding in many of our efforts in making a difference. Yes, sir, you certainly are. Now think about it. What has happened steadily since 2003 in this country? Since George Soros stated that he was going to turn his attentions to the United States. The same thing that happened in Ukraine and all these other countries. A steady divide on all fronts. In our case, religion, gender, race, etc. Coupled with more and more activist NGOs like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Women's March Incorporated, and Antifa, amongst others, and more protests/riots. Now, is that a coincidence that all these things have slowly gotten worse since 2003? Now there's so many protests and riots all the time, friggin' once a year, once every other year, which is really something that George Soros' Open Society Fund knows quite a lot about, being that from 1993 to 2012, Ari Neher was its president. Now, Ari Neher was one of the founders of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which is the group that spearheaded the chaos and protests of the 60s and 70s, including, but not limited to, what turned into the Kent State Massacre. Right? That was SDS, which was founded by Ari Neher, who was the president of Soros's main organization for 20 years. So this shouldn't be surprised. This is something that they know is tried and true. It's a clear-cut formula that has quite obviously worked for him many times, many more times than I've even mentioned in this video. And he's been working on it with us for a long time. Just to recap, a man who started a, quote, charity organization named the Open Society Foundation, who then hired the founder of one of the most infamous radical protester groups in history to run it, who then proceeded to set up and/or fund local student activist groups such as the IRF, Kamara, Otpor, and many more all across Europe, who then, surprise, surprise, used violent protests and emotional psyops to collapse several governments. All on record, all admitted. He then states in 2003 that he's bringing the fight to the U.S. and admits to pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into media companies and student activist groups who all seemingly push open borders while also pumping out content with an anti-American undertone. A man who in his book, The Age of Fallibility, states that he believes, quote, the main obstacle to a stable and just world is the United States. Okay, think about all that for a second. But when you suggest that the steady influx of organized protesters, which began in the late 2000s and hasn't stopped since, are being funded by George Soros, you're called crazy. Right? The evidence speaks for itself. And I'm sure many of these deep state lowlives are just licking their chops, waiting for us to go the way of those other countries. I mean, we're pretty much there with Obama. And then once Trump shocked the world, they one by one tried all their same tricks. BS exit polls, claim Russia rigged the election, massive protests organized by NGOs, complete media blitz. They thought that this would be like when they temporarily lost control of Ukraine in 2010, that they'd pull out all the stops and shortly be able to continue what they were doing with Obama, like they had originally planned to do with Soros's good friend Hillary.
He's backed away from the day-to-day operation of his businesses and is giving away his billions now with the same determination that he made them in places like Haiti, a country that has less money in the bank than he does. Last month, he brought the First Lady with him for a look at some of the projects his foundation is funding.
This is Mr. George Soros, and he's going to be helping the hospital.
Yeah, I'm sure Haiti is really glad that Soros introduced her to that place. Yeah. All right, so that's Soros taking the then First Lady Hillary Clinton down to Haiti, not the other way around. So still think he doesn't have influence over Washington? Now do you get why there was endless protests following the election? Because that's what this guy does. He's been at war with America since 2003. He runs the ground operations to protest riot division of the cabal and the alt media arm of the cabal. And they've been sinking their control in here since the early 1900s, and this seems to be their end game. It's a setup. These are paid agitators. Oh, look, they burned down another AutoZone, just like they did in Ferguson. It's a formula that they used in Europe for years, with Soros bragging about it, no less. And here's Bernie Sanders' field organizer, Martin Weisgerber, stating on a hidden camera nearly 5 months ago that if Bernie didn't win, he was ready to start tearing bricks up and start fighting. Now there are pallets of bricks being left everywhere, spotted in multiple spots in Dallas, Manhattan, and reports of them popping up in other cities too. And here's someone who looks an awful lot like Martin Weisgerber, caught on film paying protesters. All right, people getting called out all over the place for being paid agitators. The cop, Chauvin, was a security guard at the same club as Floyd. I mean, what are the odds that these two know each other? And look at these, quote, EMTs. They don't even give him CPR or follow any protocol before they put him on a stretcher. And if you look closer, they aren't even EMTs. They have cop uniforms on, all right? And now paid protesters who aren't even from this area are in every major city in America, burning, looting, and sparking violence. Exactly how it went down in Euromaidan in 2014. This is a formula. You have to detach yourself from the emotion of it all for a few minutes and look at it from a formulaic mindset. Here's a Ukrainian breaking down the events of Odessa that happened in May 2nd, 2014. Now, Odessa was a tragic situation where Odessian pro-Euromaidan protesters rushed an anti-Maidan rally, culminating with them all retreating to this building, which was then burnt down by Molotov cocktails and killed a whole bunch of people. It was really tragic. But listen to what the locals have to say about it.
On the international level, media sources of the new Ukrainian government tried to make foreign viewers and governments alike believe two things. The first, as for literally any event, is that Russia had a role in this. In this particular situation, a sabotage role. And the second being that contrary to the chart I just showed earlier of Euromaidan protesters and ultranationalists moving from west eastward, tried to make it seem that all of these protesters were done by locals and citizens of that particular region, in this case Odessians. Amateur footage and primary sources tell of a different story, however, with pro-Ukrainians being captured, interrogated, and caught with lethal weapons while admitting what region they're from and how much they were paid. Even without the need for that, an average Eastern European will clearly hear the difference in dialect and accent. Here is more aftermath eyewitness testimonies explaining to a European OSCE investigator what the majority of Odessians knew and thought. These old senior citizens would be labeled as pro-Russians. By the way,
дети горели, пожилые люди горели. Кто это сделал? Абсолютно невинные. Сами одесситы это сделали. Я, вот она и
Думскую кто разносил?
Почему неправильно освещают в Европе события в Украине? Объясните мне. Неправильно. Я интернет смотрю. Вот неправильно. Все замалчивается. Все одна ложь идет. Правду нам, вернее, в Европе не говорят нигде, ни в Америке, нигде. Почему нас не защищают? СМИ украинское занялось такой ложью, так все переворачивает, зомбирует людей. Люди верят в это, потому что натравливают на Россию. Россия, войска, Россия не собирается к нам оккупировать. Оккупировал Евросоюз и Америка нас. И уничтожают украинский народ.
So that's a local saying how it's being misrepresented in the news and that this isn't Odessians doing this. Right? Then he breaks down further how locals could tell that their accents were in Odessian, something that people like us watching in the Western media would never realize.
Going back to the mainstream media's mentioning how it was done by locals, remember how I mentioned the dialect difference? It would be like saying if there's a pro-Republican revolution in New York City, the media like CNN and Fox say it's all done by New Yorkers. But yet all Republicans have guns and the New Yorkers hear those pro-Republicans speaking with a Texas accent. People in China, for example, or a person in Europe probably won't be able to hear the difference between a Brooklyn accent and a Texas accent, besides the choice of words used, just as most American media viewers cannot differentiate a Russian and an Eastern Ukrainian dialect, and I'm not even mentioning the regional dialects such as Odessa versus, say, any Western Ukrainian region like Ivano-Frankovsk. This person right here is commanding some of the right sector forces, and he doesn't even come close to an Odessian accent. He is also one of the responsible shooters at civilians, which you're about to see.
Почалося з того, що ультраси хотіли пройти ходою. Їм цього не дали зробити, тому що проросійські активісти, які тут зібралися, вони озброєні, вони агресивно настроєні, в них є коктейлі, в них є піротехніка, в них є все. Мої хлопці пішли з пустими руками. Моїх 4 ранені, і в мене нога теж в тому числі.
This person is not a police officer, but a right sector militia unit commander. Footage on your screens right now shows that same individual shooting towards the trade union building at people that were trying to jump from the second floor to the ground to escape the black smoke from the interior fire that was growing from the Molotov cocktails thrown at it by right sector and ultras. Because the new government supported the Ukrainian nationalist movements and supported right sector, this person, instead of being arrested and persecuted for crimes against murdering civilians, instead got to do his own interview and was hailed as a hero of Ukraine. Keep in mind that the pro-Russian activists inside the trade union building were not armed with firearms, and by this point they were trapped inside the building.
Right there. Non-Odessians were brought in to pretend like they were Odessians and create havoc and riot and far worse, as you just saw. Same formula in Yugoslavia, same formula in Georgia, and same as in the Orange Revolution. Now, after Euromaidan succeeded, Poroshenko and Yatsenyuk became president and prime minister respectively, and now cut off from any sort of dealings with Russia, putting them at the mercy of the EU and the Obama administration / Soros. And it was reported in the media by the Euromaidan press, which was supported by Soros's IRF. So, as you just heard, people like this were painted as heroes, imposters. Up is down, left is right, white is black, just like the cabal and Soros have been doing here for years and probably would have continued to do at a steady pace if his friend Hillary would have won. However, it seems like this operation was kicked into overdrive after Trump was elected. They clearly were not expecting that. And they've pulled out all the stops one by one. You know, just like how in 2004 in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, they said, oh, it was rigged. Look at the exit polls. Russia rigged the elections. They tried all that same stuff here, and they went through it all one by one, trying to impeach him, trying to set him up with the Russia investigation. Another thing that has just come out, that it was a total crime perpetrated by the Obama administration. Totally out of the news cycle with all this. So they pulled out all the stops. And remarkably, after failing to oust Trump, despite some initial success, it's now appearing to have had the opposite effect. It seems to be snapping a lot of people awake and alerting them to the fact of just how un-grassroots and incredibly organized and planned out these movements have been. And it's certainly opening people's eyes to the over-corruption of the Obama administration, who all just had a grand time attaching themselves to Ukraine's natural resources, which now, thanks to these released audio files of Kerry and Biden's phone calls to Poroshenko, we finally have undeniable, definitive proof that they were indeed using American taxpayers' money to bribe their new space on the grand chessboard. An extremely criminal act. Where we go one, we go on.
the revolutions of 1989 funded a lot of dissident activities, civil society groups in Eastern Europe, in Poland, the Czech Republic. Are you doing similar things in Ukraine?
And we played an important part in events now.
Soros makes huge bets on whole countries and economies. Last year, when he saw cracks in the Asia boom, he began selling the currency in Thailand. Traders in Hong Kong followed suit, triggering a financial crisis that plunged much of Asia into a depression.
In the last 2 years, you've been blamed for financial collapse of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding.
The Prime Minister of Malaysia said that the region spent 40 years trying to build up its economy, and along comes a moron like Soros with a lot of money, and it's all over. He called you a criminal.
It's easier for him to blame an outside force than to admit that they were mismanaging their economy and their currency. The French finance minister talked about hanging speculators from lampposts.
Soros says the Asian currencies would have collapsed even if he hadn't been in the market. They were overvalued. He says people tend to follow his lead because he's been so successful.
I think that I've been blamed for everything. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do.